3 angels of death followed Beatrice Price through her life, and each one was crueler than the last. The first came dressed as consumption, creeping into her father's lungs while she sat beside his bed reading scripture to a man who grew thinner by the week. She was 19 when Pastor Martin Price finally slipped away, so fragile in the end that Trixie, as everyone called her, wondered whether there had been anything left for God to collect. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, so she was orphaned twice over before she could properly grieve either loss. 19 was too old to consider oneself an orphan, she knew, but it was what the consumption had made of her. The loneliness after her father's passing had her dreaming up stories of how life would be different had her mother survived. Maybe she would not be drowning in debt to a cruel landlord. Maybe she would not be walking the streets in search of work every morning and coming home exhausted and empty-handed each night. Women were not meant for lives like Lee's, she knew. If she had listened to her father and married Luca before he enlisted, she would be cared for by his family. But he had been eager to throw himself into the trenches, leaving her with nothing but a brass ring and a promise to return. She wrote him letters from time to time and did not send them. What would be the point? He could not read. Trixie walked the streets during the day, and she waited at night, but the skies stayed grey and the winds stayed cold. She clung to survival desperately, her life running like a string parallel to death, always close and never touching. On one such evening, she found herself in the garrison pub, against her better knowledge. Her father had warned her about places like these and the men who tended to inhabit them. Even as she tried to make herself small, she could feel their eyes drag across her warily, and the man behind the bar was no different. She ordered gin, blurting out the name of the first drink that came to mind. He gave her a once-over and asked if the drink was for her. She glanced at the empty bar stool beside her and asked who else it could possibly be for. The answer satisfied him enough, though he grumbled as he went to fix her a glass. She would not be able to afford it. She was barely making rent as it was. But this was not the kind of place where men offered to buy drinks for girls, and, more importantly, she was not the kind of girl men bought drinks for. As she sipped from the glass, she suppressed her own coughs at the burn, much stronger than the wine from church. The bartender asked where she was from. She answered simply that she was from here, avoiding the question she knew he was actually trying to ask. Her dark skin was an unusual sight for most of the people in Birmingham, and despite her permanent residence in the city, nobody ever seemed to get used to it. She told him her father had been Pastor Martin. He said he did not go to church. She said neither did she. He pointed at the ring on her hand and asked if she was married. She told him she was engaged, that her fiancé was fighting. The bartender shrugged and said, so was everybody. Then she admitted, suddenly and without pride, that she needed a job. She had no income, and rent was due in 3 days. He made a big show of laughing, throwing his head back and patting his chest heartily. Trixie waited. When she did not join in, his grin dropped from his face. Soberly, he told her they did not hire women. He suggested she try the brothel 3 doors down, said they always had openings. Trixie flattened her lips into a line. She told him she had no interest in being a whore, but that she was good with numbers, and she could read. He asked her to prove it, tossing a newspaper across the bar. She read the first article aloud, and he snatched it back, skimming the words as if to verify. Then he asked her name. She told him Beatrice Price. He shrugged and called it a nice party trick. The drink was 10 shillings. She threw the change down and hopped off the bar stool. Another long day of walking, another night empty-handed. The second angel of death struck the day before rent was due and made Trixie a widow. Part of her knew what the telegram would say before she opened it, so she made a point of cooking dinner very slowly to put it off just a bit longer. When she had settled at the table to eat, she swallowed thickly and tore the seal from the paper. Private Luca de Silvio died of gunshot wounds November 21st, 1917. Trixie cried that night for the first time in years. What was she supposed to do with herself but waste away? In the morning, her landlord would come to collect money she did not have, and if the war ever ended, nobody would come home to her. The brothel was not looking so bad anymore. She resolved to go down the next night, anything to stay alive. In the morning, it was not the landlord who woke her by banging incessantly on the door. Her eyes were puffy from the night before, but she could make out through the window a dark-haired woman in a hat. The woman called out a name that was almost right, but not quite. Beatrice Prince. Trixie pulled the door open, still dressed in her night slip, and corrected her. Price, Beatrice Price. The woman introduced herself as Polly Shelby. She seemed either not to notice or not to care that Trixie had been rude. She pushed past her into the cramped apartment, spinning in a circle as she sized it up. She said she had heard Trixie was good with numbers. Trixie's eyes bugged out in disbelief. She stammered that yes, she was good with numbers, good with money too, and she could read. Polly explained that her accountant had just got killed in a German trench, and she needed someone to help out her business. Trixie said she could help. Polly asked if she had gone to school. Trixie said not, technically. Polly asked if she was particularly fussy about her morals. Trixie's eyes darted over to the Bible on her nightstand. Maybe before, yes, when she had something to lose. But whatever test of strength God was trying to throw her way had just broken her. Now she had nothing but herself. She told Mrs. Shelby she was not fussy, not any more. Polly nodded slowly, giving her another once-over, and asked when she could start. Trixie's third angel of death was named Thomas Shelby. Where the first two had taken, he destroyed. And in the ashes he left in his wake, Beatrice Price found herself reborn into something she did not yet recognize. He had given himself a 1-week grace period when the war ended, mostly to quell Polly's nerves, but he would be lying if he said he did not need it. All that digging had left an ache in his shoulders that refused to fade. Not to mention the dreams of the bombs, or the way he could close his eyes and drift back to the trenches in France. On the day he returned to work, Tommy vowed that he was finished with taking orders. He would march into Polly's office, demand back his position, and make known to the city that a new generation of Peaky blinders was taking charge. And this time they would be far less merciful. When he arrived, though, it was not his aunt behind the desk. Instead, a small woman in her 20s sat waiting, clad in pearl earrings and a black dress. Her short hair had been waved neatly. Her eyes were outlined with charcoal. She did not look up at him, did not acknowledge him. She just continued scratching numbers down into her papers and muttering to herself as she skimmed through the books. He said hello after a long moment of waiting in the doorway. That got her attention. The woman stood up and stepped out from behind the desk, bowing her head slightly and offering him a half smile. Mr. Shelby, in her heels, she stood almost as tall as him. Looking remarkably unimpressed, she offered a lace-bloused hand for him to shake. He ignored it. He asked if she was some kind of whore. She looked down at her body as if checking to make sure, and after a moment of brief inspection said, not that she knew of. She dropped her hand. She introduced herself as Beatrice Price, Mrs. Gray's accountant. Tommy disagreed. Polly did not need an accountant. His aunt had been trained in finance. She did not need some outsider to help out. The woman said nothing, just arched an eyebrow challengingly. Interesting. Tommy took 3 long steps towards her, stopping just short of a collision, and waited for her to flinch. She did not move, just tilted her head back and stared up at him. He asked who she really was. She repeated her name, her voice still achingly sweet. Mrs. Gray's accountant. Polly appeared in the doorway, a cigarette between her fingers. Tommy demanded to know who the woman was. Polly told him Beatrice Price was her accountant, and to stop harassing her. He protested that Polly did not need an accountant. Polly reminded him that before, when all the boys were home to help out, maybe not. But since they had all been gone, someone had to run things, and she could not be bothered with tracking numbers when she was doing business. Trixie had been a real help. He whirled back around to Beatrice, who he found smirking in victory. Anger bubbled up in his stomach. He had been gone, yes, he had had no choice. But he had never met this woman in his life. How was she now involved with his family's finances? Especially given the kind of business they were involved in. How was he supposed to trust some stranger? He announced that they were back now and they would not need her working here any more. Polly sighed, exasperated. She told Trixie to stay put and continue working. Trixie nodded, returning to the seat behind the desk and resuming her muttering, much to Tommy's annoyance. Before he could object, Polly seized his arm and dragged him out the door, shutting it behind them. She hissed at him, asking what the hell he thought he was doing. He stated flatly that she had brought in an outsider. Polly told him to calm down. The woman would not betray them. Everybody else she knew was dead. That calmed him down, but only marginally. He said people were always making new friends in places like this. Polly made a non-committal noise and said she would not be so sure, not during times like these. Tommy stared down at his aunt. Despite the height disparity, she matched him in force. He said Arthur would not be too happy about this. His older brother, now in charge of the family, had always shared Tommy's dislike for outsiders. Surely Beatrice would be no different. Polly waved him off. Arthur was fine with it. She stayed. And Tommy was not to argue. He gritted his teeth, reaching into his pocket for a cigarette instead of answering. Polly flattened her lips into a line, her eyes still glued to him as she offered him the box of matches. She told him to behave. He laughed bitterly, breaking his eyes away from his aunt and glancing out the window at the bustling street outside as he swiped the match across the book. He was Thomas Shelby. He had not returned home from 3 years of hell just to take more orders. But the look Polly fixed him with communicated that he did not have much of a choice. If he wanted to make his grab for power, he had to stay on his aunt's good side. It was not ideal, the waiting game, but he knew this business well enough to understand when sacrifices needed to be made. When he was in charge, he would throw the woman out of their family's business. It was only a matter of time. 11 months passed. There were no more blue skies left in Birmingham. Even on the rare days when the clouds receded, the thick plumes of smoke from the new factories billowed out into the air and blocked out the sun, casting grey shadows across the entire city and swallowing it whole. Trixie had grown used to it, sure, but she found herself missing the days when her father would take her further from the city and give her the chance to see the sun. She found herself missing a lot of things. It was foolish. She was too busy to dwell on the past. Watery Lane was noisy, the heavy industry construction sending thuds ringing out across the horizon. Children ran around playing and crying. As she pulled the door open to number 5, signing the cross at the horseshoe over the door, she stepped inside the Shelby house and enjoyed the silence for a few brief moments. Finn, the youngest of the Shelby siblings, asked if she was praying. She winked one eye open and told him no, just catching her breath. It was cold outside. Finn informed her that Tommy said the cold was good, drives people to desperation. Trixie replied that Tommy was an idiot, hoping the devil in question was lurking somewhere in the house to overhear. To his credit, he was right for the most part. The cold was good for business, typically, but not with their latest horse-racing venture. People needed spare money they could bet, or at least let the hope of the warmer season drive them to spend money they did not have. With autumn in full force, neither were guaranteed. Finn warned her that Tommy would kill him if he heard her say that. Trixie said she hoped so, swiping the cigarette from Finn and throwing it into the fire. No 10-year-old boy should be smoking, especially not in the house. Polly's voice drifted down the hallway from her office, calling Trixie in. Trixie patted Finn on the head and promised him sweets after work. "Chocolate?" he asked, his voice lifting an octave with hope. Trixie shrugged. Anything for the birthday boy. She removed her hat and coat, making her way down the hallway. Trixie knew that it was only proper that she wear heels to work, but the loud noise they made against the hollow floors was nearly painful. As a woman in her line of work, she preferred to move around, unseen and unheard. It was where she could be most effective. The heels were like a bell, announcing her arrival and intentions, 2 things she typically preferred to keep secret. To her dismay, Polly was not the only one waiting. Thomas Shelby had joined her in the office, and he made a point of blowing a cloud of smoke in Trixie's direction as she entered. She asked if this was a conversation she could have from the doorway. Polly told her to sit. Trixie obeyed, sinking down into the wooden chair and folding her coat across her lap, pointedly dodging Tommy's eyes. Polly announced that they had had a meeting the night before. Trixie nodded. She had been with John when Arthur announced it. Polly said it looked like there was a new copper in town. Trixie asked if he was one of theirs. Polly shook her head and gestured to Tommy. He informed Trixie that the man was a chief inspector from Belfast. Scudboat and some of the others had seen him in a bar handing out recruitment flyers. Balancing the cigarette between his lips, he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. When she opened it, she found an advertisement seeking men over 5 feet and in fighting condition. This was not good, she knew. Cops could be divided into 2 categories: slimy bastards that were on the Peaky blinders payroll and slimy bastards who were not. The first, at least, were useful from time to time. These men seemed to fall solidly into the second category. She asked why they were here. Nothing had changed recently. Polly's voice was pointed with anger as she asked Tommy to explain. Trixie bit back a smirk. Polly seemed to be the only one capable in the world of scorning Tommy, and it was always a treat to bear witness to it. She watched him hesitate to open his mouth, knowing full well that he did not trust her, even though she had never given him any reason not to. He was just like that. He had made up his mind about her 11 months ago when he returned from war, and she had made up her mind about him. Nothing either seemed to do could sway the other's opinion. He said there had been a robbery. Trixie arched an eyebrow. There was always a robbery. That was the business. He corrected her. A robbery gone wrong. She waited as he took another long drag from the cigarette in a seeming effort to delay his explanation further. She could be patient when she wanted to be. He explained that he had had some men stealing motorcycles from the BSA factory for a buyer in London. They took the wrong crate. Her brow furrowed. She asked what was in the crate they took. Tommy looked back and forth between her and his aunt, almost asking permission. Polly gestured with her cigarette. "Well, go on then," he sighed. 25 Lewis machine guns. Trixie gaped. Sweet Mother of God. To emphasize his point, Tommy added 10,000 rounds of ammunition, 50 semi-automatic rifles, and 200 pistols with shells. She blanched, eyes glancing up towards the ceiling and heaven as she steepled her hands together and muttered a quick prayer. She asked if he could not simply send his men back to return the guns. The glare Tommy sent her dropped the temperature in the room by a few degrees. She apologized quickly. "Mr. Shelby," Polly announced that they needed someone to get eyes on the copper. It had to be Trixie. Straightening in her chair, Trixie tried not to let her surprise show on her face. It was not odd for Polly to confide in her. She had been briefed on most everything that the family was involved in. She managed most of their money. She was the only accountant Arthur trusted to verify their numbers. But her work had always been strictly behind the desk or in the Shelby's betting parlour, calculating odds and tracking statistics in their books. She asked why. Polly explained that Trixie would have enough distance from the family. Tommy added, just to be a bastard about it, that she was not one of them. Trixie smiled at him sweetly and pointed out that she did not have that much distance. She worked here. She did not speak to practically anyone except his family and the tailor in the Italian quarter who made her hats. Polly said they would make up a reason for her to betray them. It would not be an issue. They just needed to know where his investigation was going, and if it was pointing to them, she would throw him off the scent. Trixie agreed. She asked what the reason was. This time it was Polly who delayed her answer by ashing her cigarette in a tray on her desk and flicking the butt out her office's open window. "Lovers quarrel," she answered finally. Trixie asked her to repeat that. Polly pointed between her and Tommy. "Lovers quarrel," she repeated. Trixie narrowed her eyes, looking over at Thomas and trying to make sense of Polly's words. She would choose death over spending any more time with him than necessary, and she got the feeling that one day she would. What was she supposed to do with the words, "lovers quarrel"? Polly explained that all she would have to do was have one fight down by the cut, and word would spread. If he needed something, he would come to Trixie. Tommy interjected that the plan had been for her to go with Arthur. Polly reminded him that Arthur was not in charge, though was he? Tommy sat back in his chair. Though he was the oldest of the Shelbys and technically their leader, Arthur lived his life halfway down a bottle of whiskey. He hardly had enough sense to button up his vest, let alone run an elaborate criminal operation. Polly said it would not take the inspector long to figure out who was behind the robbery, especially if he was as much of a problem as Tommy said. And she should hope he had his head on straight enough to realize that a few lies were better than being strung up and hanged. Trixie bit her tongue. She was hardly pleased with this plan, but one fight by the cut was hardly an issue. It would probably involve less pretending to fight Tommy than to carry on as though she liked him. Besides, what choice did she have? If Tommy was caught, the blinders would go down, and her with them. She held no other allegiances or loyalties, had no other allies. No matter how unfortunate she found it, it did not change the fact that her best interests were aligned with his. She asked what she was to tell him. Polly said she would have to make herself useful enough for him to want to keep her around. Trixie thought she could manage that. After all, what had she been doing during her time with the Peaky Blinders? She asked whether she was to wait for him to approach her, or should she go to him. Polly instructed her to wait. Word travels. Women talk. Trixie smiled to herself and said it was one of the things they did. Polly nodded sharply, glad they had got this all in order, and told her to head to work. There was a specific kind of fondness that accompanied the smile Polly sent her. Maternal, almost. Trixie could not be sure, as she did not have any model to compare it to, but she liked to imagine that, despite Tommy's contempt for her, she could find some sort of belonging with the Peaky Blinders if she worked at it hard enough. If anyone in the world cared for her, it would be Polly. a mother without children and a daughter without parents. But Trixie hesitated to put weight on the relationship when she was not yet sure of its strength. Leaving the office in favor of the betting parlor out back, she dug hurriedly into her purse for a cigarette. The meeting had made her late, and while nobody in the parlor had any real authority to punish her, the work would not slow down. She liked to arrive early to work to keep the money from piling up uncounted, and now she had lost her head start. She struck the match as she walked, no longer worried about the clicking of her heels against the wood. The curtain dividing the betting parlor from the main house was practically a door between worlds, pushing her from the quiet family home she had just been in towards a bustling city of gambling men. At only 8:30 in the morning, the chaos had begun, with men shouting numbers and horses' names back and forth. Her only solace recently had been John Shelby, who was currently throwing down a glass of whiskey as he hurriedly scratched numbers onto the back wall's chalkboard. She asked if it was not a little early. She pulled the glass from his hand and set it down, handing him her handkerchief for his split lip. John accepted the fabric, dabbing at his bloodied lip and handing it back to her. She placed it back into her purse and clicked it shut. She asked if it had been a rough night. He corrected her. Good night. Could not remember most of it, though. She laughed. That sounded about right for John. She patted him fondly on the shoulder and took her seat at the head of the table, where runners were already desperately counting out money for the day's races. A fair amount of cash had piled up, and she hurried to begin counting, removing the gloves from her hands to keep them clean and stop her fingers from slipping as she fanned out bills. Behind her, John shouted out bets for the Kempton at 2:30. Trixie moved her hands rapidly over the growing piles of coins and bills that the other men had counted and ordered. They were good enough at their jobs, but there was nobody Arthur trusted like Trixie, leaving her to verify that the processed amounts had been accurate. At this point the motions were almost a habit. Every day the tops of her arms would grow numb as she pushed herself to work faster, stacking coins, fanning out bills, weighing piles of change. Her earrings swung as she moved, brushing the sides of her neck as she finished one pile and reached for the next. She called out to Martin that he was undercounting again. Coins skidded across the table before another one of the runners returned with the top hat to collect the amount she had just balanced. Martin apologized. She eyed his open bottle of whiskey but did not say anything, knowing that if she considered his numbers again, she would lose track of the amount she was on for the next pile. It was already a distracting enough atmosphere. Men bustled around calling out the names of their favoured racehorses, and John, bless him, shouted out rapid statistics as he chalked down numbers on the board in the back. Despite the distraction it caused, she found she did not mind the chaos, especially not when things were looking as good as they were. Monaghan Boy, Tommy's horse, was collecting most of the bets, which meant Trixie was going to get a larger commission this month, which meant she was going to be able to buy the hat she had been eyeing a few lanes down in the Italian quarter, and then maybe new curtains for her apartment. The hours of work passed quickly, and by the time the betting window had closed, Martin's bottle of whiskey was nearly empty, and the rest of the men at the table had sunk into a pleasant state of drunken joy. Not Trixie. Never Trixie. She liked the opportunity the men gave her when they got drunk and sloppier, and she was able to correct their work. She became all the more useful, all the more necessary, so long as she stayed sharp as others faded away. John asked how it was looking, waving away the man in the seat next to her. The man scurried away, and John collapsed down into his place. Trixie glanced down at the numbers in the book. Very good. John asked if all bets were on Monaghan Boy. She said almost. Only a marginal amount for anybody else. Hardly a problem. John shrugged. Keeps things looking fair, right? Trixie smirked at him. Something like that. The room suddenly grew quiet, and Trixie glanced up to find Tommy strolling in through the doorway, pristine as ever. Without the cloud of smoke clinging to him, he seemed too sharp to be real. His eyes too blue. Trixie pursed her lips. John called Tommy over to look at the numbers. All for Monaghan Boy. Again. Tommy leaned in, his presence like a knife, wavering dangerously close to Trixie's face as he inspected the numbers over her shoulder. He commended John's work, clapping his brother on the back and nodding curtly in Trixie's direction. Beatrice. She rolled her eyes, slamming the book shut and nearly missing John's thumb. He complained. Oh! She assured him it was not meant for him, just his brother. John said flatly that one of these days she was going to get herself killed, you know. There it was. The second admonition from one of Tommy's brothers. Trixie was due to see Ada later. Maybe if she stopped by Arthur's office before leaving, she could get each of his siblings to warn her about the dangers of crossing him. She glanced back out at the crowd of men where Tommy and Arthur were having a heated discussion in Arthur's office. Well, Arthur looked heated, slamming his fists down on his desk, while Tommy leaned patiently against the wall and waited for his brother's outburst to finish. She agreed distantly. Maybe, but Thomas Shelby was not the worst thing she had had to survive. John laughed at that, stepping back up to the chalkboards and scratching down the numbers the other runners were calling out. He asked what kind of hell she had been through then. She shrugged. It was not important. John pointed down to the brass ring on her finger and asked if it had anything to do with that. She repeated that it was not important, drawing her fingers into a fist and hiding her hand behind her back as subtly as she could. She changed the subject, asking what had got Arthur so angry. John explained that Arthur did not like when Tommy went over his head, made him feel threatened. It made Trixie feel threatened, too. The closer Tommy got to seizing power, the closer she got to being thrown back out on the streets. If she was better tempered, maybe she would put some effort into trying to get on his good side. But where she lacked in attitude, she made up for in intelligence. Trixie was smart enough to know that it would be a total waste of time. The best she could offer was staying out of his way, and she was already prone to that when it came to the Shelby men. She was a woman. She knew her place. John asked if she wanted some whiskey, nudging her with his elbow and pointing unsteadily at the bottle. She shook her head, eyes drifting back over to Tommy in the office. Lovers quarrel. She nearly snorted out a laugh. Trixie would die before loving Tommy Shelby. Heaven help her. The morning of the quarrel arrived at 7:30 because Thomas Shelby did not believe in sleeping in, and he certainly did not believe in giving Beatrice Price the courtesy of a warning. Trixie peered through her front window, still dressed in striped pajamas that had once belonged to Luca, and found him waiting on her doorstep with his hands in his pockets, looking immaculate in his three-piece suit, while the sun had barely crested the rooftops. She yanked the door open and demanded to know what he was doing there, how he knew where she lived. He pressed the door with his fingertips and she moved aside, startled, allowing him to sweep past her into the cramped flat. He asked if there was anything in this city he did not know. She told him she was positive she could find something. He ignored her, inspecting the few charcoal sketches tacked up on her wall, the ones Luca had drawn before shipping out. Trixie felt the violation of it, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Those were private. Those were sacred. She told him to stop staring. He told her to hurry up. The men at the cargo port started working at 7, and they needed to be at the cut before the first batches were unloaded. Trixie sat down at her table, spooned porridge into her mouth with deliberate slowness, and watched him settle into Luca's chair as though he owned it. She had not disturbed that chair since the telegram arrived. He threw himself into it like it was nothing, like everything was nothing to him. After a long moment under his scrutinizing gaze, she pushed back from the table and announced she was going to get dressed. She swore to Christ that if he so much as glanced in her direction, she would sell him out to the copper herself. For the first time since she had known him, the corner of his mouth quirked upward. He looked younger for that moment, less God, more human. The humanity faded as quickly as it had arrived, and she brushed past him toward her armoire. At the canal, the performance began without rehearsal. Tommy pressed her back against the brick wall with 3 long strides, one hand closing around her neck in what looked like a chokehold, the other braced firmly against the small of her back to keep her from toppling backwards into the water. Passers-by watched. Trixie felt his fingers burn white-hot against her skin, felt her pulse hammer, not from alarm, but from the thrill of closeness. She had not been touched by another person since Luca left for the war. Over a year of gloves and solitude, and now Tommy Shelby's hand was on her throat, and she leaned into it almost instinctively before catching herself. She snapped her eyes open. His face hovered mere inches from hers, studying her closely. She recognized something in his expression. Was it victory? Was it power? Something else entirely? She informed him that he could look less like he was enjoying this. He replied that he had been about to say the same. He leaned in close to her ear, breath hot, and asked if she was still feeling brave. She was grateful not to be fair like Ada, or else the blush on her cheeks would have given something away. He released her neck and pulled her back toward him. She stumbled forward into his chest with a grunt, catching a whiff of his cologne, subtle and deep and expensive. To her horror, she found herself enjoying the scent. After finding her footing, she stood up straight and fixed him with a glare. She told him she did not think he would have actually thrown her in. He asked why not. She pushed up toward his face, testing to see how still he would remain, and told him it was because he needed her. He turned his head and flicked his cigarette past her into the canal. He said they had never needed her, Miss Price. She was only around because Polly needed an assistant. Accountant, she corrected. Do not dare treat me like I am nothing. He paused, and she braced for an insult, but instead he gave a half shrug and said they would see how useful she could make herself with this new copper. She shoved past him and carried on down the street toward the garrison, ignoring the loud, heavy click of her heels on the concrete. His long strides caught up easily. She did not speak to him. As they reached the corner, he ducked his head toward her, muttered something about eyes being on them, and pressed a chaste kiss on the side of her face. When he pulled away, she craned her neck and found a group of women watching them intently from across the street. They disbanded the moment she started staring. Tommy had already begun walking toward the office. Trixie stood flabbergasted on the corner, one hand raised to her cheek, wondering what in the world had just happened. Inside the garrison, the stench of whiskey hung heavy, and men from the shipyards were already drinking despite the early hour. Trixie sat down at the bar and crossed her ankles delicately, waiting for Harry. Instead, a pretty blonde with an Irish lilt appeared before her and asked how she could help. Trixie jumped in her seat. The woman introduced herself as Grace. She had just started working there. Trixie studied her carefully. Pretty, thin, but clearly not starving. Clothes bright and neatly pressed, tailored well enough to recognize the work of a seamstress. She asked for a coffee. Harry appeared soon after, pointing at Grace behind him and remarking that she was a nice girl. Trixie nodded, but responded that she was not sure how many nice girls ended up working in bars like this. She asked where the woman was from. Galway, Harry replied. He had warned her about working here, but she had been awfully insistent. Had references and everything. Trixie watched Grace hum as she brewed a pot of coffee and poured some into a mug. Nobody in their right mind chose the garrison. Even when Trixie had tried to get hired the previous year, it had been a last resort before prostitution. This woman had come here on purpose. She wanted something, and paired with the sudden arrival of an Irish copper, Trixie doubted very much that her intentions were good. She ordered her coffee with milk and no sugar, and while Grace prepared it, Trixie asked what brought her to Birmingham. Grace said she had just needed a change of environment. Trixie noted the pause. She mentioned that her fiancé's family was here, so she did not mind it much. The weather was dreadful, though. Grace offered congratulations on the engagement and asked when the wedding was. Trixie replied flippantly that they had not set a date yet. He got quite busy with work. Grace asked what kind. Trixie paused. Business, she answered eventually. He was quite powerful around here. Grace asked if she would have heard of him. Maybe, Trixie said, playing coy. His name was Thomas Shelby. She watched Grace's reaction carefully. Suddenly the blonde was very focused on finding a rag with which to wipe down the bar, even though nobody had spilled anything recently. It was still a hunch. Maybe she had simply heard of Tommy since her arrival and was reacting to the reputation he maintained. Or maybe she had come here specifically for the Shelbys. Either way, they could not trust her. Trixie took a long sip of her coffee, enjoying the burn against her tongue, thanked Grace, and left without paying. Harry insisted it was on the house. Outside, Trixie walked hastily toward 5 Watery Lane, her mind racing. Trouble had come to Birmingham, and she worried it had not taken the form of a chief inspector, but the form of a pretty Irish barmaid. She marched straight to Polly's office and threw the door open. Polly grabbed her gun and pointed it in Trixie's direction before recognizing her and dropping the weapon with a heavy thud onto the desk. Trixie apologized for her entrance and explained what she had discovered. Polly listened, leaning back in her chair, cigarette balanced between her fingers. She asked where in Ireland Grace was from. Galway, Trixie responded, but she had not had a good answer for why she had come here. Just that she wanted to live in a city. Polly remarked that nobody wanted to live in this city. Trixie agreed. She thought Grace might be working with the inspector, perhaps as some sort of spy. They needed to be careful. Polly nodded slowly. She asked if Trixie wanted to watch her. Trixie said she could try to give Grace information and see what happened with it, but only if Polly thought that was the best plan. Polly said she would talk it over with Tommy. Trixie smothered a sigh, which drew a smirk from the older woman. Polly changed the subject, mentioning that Tommy had said the quarrel went well. Trixie drawled that she would be quick to disagree. The knowing smile on Polly's lips cooled her frustration. Polly explained that Tommy had found it believable. He said Trixie had not apologized for the fight. At that, Trixie broke down and snorted out a laugh. Apologize for what, exactly? He was the one who had nearly thrown her into the canal by her neck. Polly conceded that did seem unnecessary. Trixie assured her it was. He just liked the attention. Polly disagreed. Tommy did not do anything for flair, unless it was deliberate. Trixie asked why he had nearly thrown her into the canal then. Was that deliberate? Polly shrugged. Depends on who was around to see it. That afternoon the garrison was packed with men in caps who shoved each other around bodily, and Trixie had to squeeze past sideways to find a seat at the bar. A man on the nearest bar stool told her to piss off without looking up. Before she could respond, Grace interrupted from behind the counter, informing the man that Trixie had a reservation. The man retorted that the garrison did not take reservations. Grace snatched his glass away and said they did now, and Trixie had one. Trixie added that it should be under the name Shelby. The man looked back and forth between them before heaving a sigh and moving off the chair. Trixie took his spot delicately and smiled at Grace. It had been a nice gesture, even if it had been made with bad intentions. Tommy appeared at the window to the Shelby's private room, calling out that whatever it was on the house. He needed a bottle of rum. Grace asked white or dark. He said he did not care. While she busied herself with the bottle, Tommy met Trixie's eyes across the bar, unflinching as always. She asked if he had had a good morning. He said nothing. Grace set the bottle down and mentioned that Harry said it was on the house. Tommy tucked it under his arm, pocketed his wallet, and turned to leave. Trixie called after him, asking if he planned to throw her back into the cut, or if they were going somewhere else. He told her to take off her gloves. On instinct, she pocketed her hands and demanded to know why. He produced a box from his pocket, black velvet on the outside. Inside, a ring. It looked beautiful. It looked expensive. Trixie felt her jaw drop open the slightest bit. He asked if she was going to wear it or not. She countered by asking if Polly had put him up to it. He paused, looking down at his shoes for a moment, and then back up at her. Yes, she scoffed. She did not think they needed a ring to prove the engagement. Just keep hanging her over the river by a thread, and everyone would know they were in love. He told her she had been safe, clearly bored with her antics. She yanked the glove off. Fine. She slipped off the engagement ring Luca had given her and replaced it with Tommy's. Shinier, brighter, newer. It felt like a betrayal, but she was not about to tell him that. He held her wrist steady in his hand, rough and calloused but surprisingly warm. Something about the touch made her forget she had a body outside of where his skin met hers. When he was through, he dropped her hand carelessly, and it fell back against her side. The moment vanished, snapped in half. He offered to take Luca's ring. She refused, dropping it into her purse and clicking the clasp shut. It would probably sell for nothing, but it was the most valuable thing she owned. It was going nowhere near Thomas Shelby. He examined her carefully for a long moment, then instructed her to keep the gloves off unless it was cold. Keep the ring on. She nodded once. Ring on. She thought she could manage that. He asked if she had heard anything from the inspector. She asked him for a cigarette. He fixed her with a surprised look, but said nothing. Bypassing her waiting hand, he placed it between her lips delicately. She thought of communion. He explained that she could not scuff up the ring. He struck a match and lit her cigarette first. After a drag, she told him Campbell had come to see her that day. At church. Tommy laughed. She nearly shuddered. He prompted her to continue. She admitted that Campbell looked rather like a pig, but he had also offered her a deal if she sold him information. Tommy asked about the parameters. She said protection, from her big, scary fiancé. He said good, unmoved. Then he asked if she had mentioned anything to Campbell about Arthur. Trixie blew out a cloud of smoke and confirmed that she had told Campbell Arthur was in charge, as Polly had instructed. She asked why. Tommy's voice went flat. Arthur had been picked up from the movie theatre earlier by a group of coppers who then attempted to beat details of the robbery out of him. The tone with which he said it was so nonchalant that Trixie nearly missed what he was saying. She dropped the cigarette on the pavement and stomped it out. Before he could answer, she turned and began hurrying towards the Shelby home. This was bad. This meant she had failed. The sidewalk fell back heavy against her heels as she rushed down the lane, Tommy catching up again easily. She had enough dignity not to run. She threw the door open heavily, forgetting her usual sign of the cross. Arthur was sprawled out across the desk chair, his face beaten and bloodied, his suit soaked through with sweat. Polly knelt at his side, wrapping his fingers. Trixie gasped. Tommy brushed past her, handing a bottle of rum to Arthur and seizing a blooded cloth from the bowl on the table. He pushed it against Arthur's face, and the older Shelby hissed. Tommy mumbled that he was okay, his voice heavy with an unnatural amount of affection. Trixie turned to Polly, already prepared to grovel. She was so sorry. Campbell had just asked her if Arthur was in charge. Polly stood up and took Trixie's hands into her own. She told her she had done the right thing. Better to send them to Arthur at the movies than to John or Polly at the parlour. The least damage was done. He did not know anything. Trixie gestured generally at his beaten form. Polly assured her firmly that Arthur had not known anything. He could not have given them anything. And anyway, Arthur seemed to have collected some information on the new inspector. Arthur looked up, his cheeks jutting out under Tommy's grip, and said that Campbell had mentioned Mr. Churchill sent him to Birmingham. National interest. Something about a robbery. Later that evening, after the family had dispersed and Trixie was collecting mugs from the dining table, Tommy called her name from the doorway. Beatrice. She turned. He gestured outside with a nod. She followed him through the betting shop and out the back entrance into the cold. He held out his jacket. She refused, saying she would look ridiculous. He countered that she would look more ridiculous if she was dead from frostbite. She shrugged it on over her shoulders. The boxy cut hung far too wide, and the hem went past her hips. It was warm, she would admit. He told her she was going to have a meeting with Campbell that night. While the boys had a bonfire, she was to distract him, then ask for his protection. Say the raid had made Tommy very, very upset. She noted his usual blank expression and observed that he seemed extremely distraught. The crease of his brow, now furrowed in response to her comment, actually did look somewhat distraught, but she just smiled. What a pair they were. He explained the plan in fragments. She would receive a likely disguised officer to escort her home. She would keep meeting with Polly and Ada from time to time, alone, to gossip, as Tommy put it. If the Lees attacked, Campbell's men would take them out. 2 birds, 1 stone. She asked why she needed protection. He shrugged. He had gotten them involved in a disagreement with another family. They knew better than to touch Polly or Ada, but she was not one of them. She asked, with a sweetness that was almost a blade, whether he cared if she came out of it alive. He ignored her and continued with the logistics. She agreed. He swore she would be back on Friday. He cocked his head to the side and offered his hand. She shook it and pulled away. She supposed she ought to get on with looking distressed. He called her damsel as a sort of farewell. She sneered dearest in return, threw her shoulders back so the jacket slid off, balled it up in her hands, shoved it into his chest, and turned back inside. At the police station that night, Trixie jutted out her bottom lip, attempting to make it quiver, as the officer behind the desk watched her with a look of fear. Men hated when women cried. She knew this. It frightened them to be out of control. She asked to speak with the inspector. Please. The officer bolted out of his chair and rummaged through the papers on the desk. She gave her name, Beatrice Price. He might also know her as Beatrice Shelby. Saying it aloud made her sick. For once, she leaned into the feeling. If she was to be as distressed as Tommy wanted her to be, she was going to need to imagine a wedding and subsequent wedding night. The idea nearly made her gag. Campbell received her in his office, pulling the armchair back so she could sit down. She sank delicately into the chair, keeping her spine straight and her purse on her lap, a picture of ladylikeness to mask her real intentions. She told him Tommy had been very upset about the raids. She was worried about what he might do. Campbell leaned forward on his elbows and asked her to tell him what happened. She hated the sound of her name in his mouth. She explained that Tommy and the rest of the men had returned from the fair that afternoon, and he had been quite angry about the intrusion on his territory. She felt the pressure growing. She wanted this to be over more than anybody. But she worried about what might happen to her as the stress got to him. Campbell considered this, picking up a pen from the jar on his desk and fiddling with it. He said he would not want to risk her getting hurt. She said she did not want the investigation to stop, but she was wondering if it was possible to have somebody protecting her. He rubbed his thumb along the line of his moustache. He would have to have an officer in from somewhere else to ensure the Shelbys did not recognize him. She said if it was too much trouble, it was no worry. She would manage. He insisted they could not have her in danger. He stared off at a point on the wall behind her. There was an officer he had worked with in Manchester looking for a transfer to be closer to his family in London. He would give him a call. Would she be all right until then? She nodded. She thought so. Thank him. As Campbell headed past her into the adjoining office to make the call, Trixie maintained her defeated facade. By the time he was outside the room, she had smoothed out her appearance and leaned forward to inspect the contents of his desk. It was mostly bare, save for a leather journal with a pen sandwiched between 2 pages in the middle of the book. She cast a look over her shoulder. He was too busy trying to dial a phone number to notice. She slid her hand across the desk, pressing her finger between the bookmarked pages and flipping it open quickly. The pages fluttered out as the cover swung to the side, revealing a web of sorts. No, a plan. In the center of the web, circled, was Arthur's name, but it had been scratched out. Beneath it, the inspector had scrawled down Tommy. The surrounding names were connected to Tommy's by arrows. At the top, dirty officers. Below that, Polly, devoted to family, will not sell out, own children. Next one down was Chinese Quarter, sealed tight. At the bottom of the page, Agent G.G. as in Grace. She wished she could take the journal and present it to Polly and Tommy, if only to prove she had been right about the strange woman. But she had enough sense not to ruin her mission for the sake of her pride. The last of the names, circled and starred, was her own, Beatrice Price, fiancée, not involved with business, willing to serve as an informant. A bit dumb, but potentially helpful. Wait a moment. She scanned the line again. Bit dumb. The floorboard creaked behind her. She jumped, flipping the journal shut quickly and slamming into the back of the chair hard enough to send it tilting. She threw her hands out towards the desk, gripping it to steady herself. When Campbell returned to the office, he looked somewhat recovered from whatever conversation had taken place on the telephone, though still shaken. She asked if everything was all right. He said yes, just 1 second, and then made the call to his friend in Manchester. She turned back ahead and followed the lines of the stained glass window above his desk. A very Catholic design for an office of the Crown. A mosaic of broken glass in bright colours that cast an odd glow over her skin when she lifted her hand to observe it. When Campbell finally returned to his chair, he assured her that as long as he was there, she had no reason to be afraid. He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. It was unusually clammy and hot, and it took all her strength not to squirm. The complete irony of the mess she had gotten herself into was not lost on her. She thanked him, sniffling and pretending to wipe away a tear. She told him he had no idea how glad she was that he had come to Birmingham. The morning after Campbell's assurance, Trixie woke to a knock on her door that had become tiresomely familiar. She peered through the window and found an unfamiliar man, crowned with blonde hair, dressed neatly in a suit, smiling with the pleasant emptiness of a photograph in a frame. She opened the door a crack and asked if she could help him. He introduced himself as Professor James Bradley. She let him in, and the moment the door shut behind him, the professor mask slipped away. He was Officer James Bradley, formerly of the Manchester Police, sent by Inspector Campbell to act as her personal guard. He listed his qualifications with the enthusiasm of a man reading his own eulogy. Cambridge degree in botany, London Police Academy, top of his class, military service, rise to sergeant. Trixie blinked the sleep from her eyes and wished, with a fervour usually reserved for prayer, that God would send, literally, anyone else. She offered him tea. He declined, informing her that caffeine corrupted the nervous system. She asked how he had enjoyed botany as a subject. He said it had been quite interesting, though he had gardeners who managed his main estate, so he rarely practiced any more. She suggested he fire his gardeners. It would give him the opportunity to practice. He laughed heartily and declared that this assignment was going to be a pleasurable experience for both of them. She cast her eyes upward at the ceiling and prayed silently for deliverance. 5 hours later, after James had inspected her bookshelf and offered his lukewarm opinions on every volume he could reach, Trixie understood what hell must be like. He had called her copy of Pygmalion charming, dismissed The Secret Garden as childish, dubbed her Austen too apolitical, her Frederick Douglass too politically involved, and declared The Scarlet Letter the finest novel mankind had yet produced. She had watched him pick up any book with a woman on the cover and call it simple. When he reached for My Bondage and My Freedom, she snatched it from his hands and placed it back on the shelf with a tenderness she usually reserved for holy objects. She did not bother hiding her contempt. By the time he dropped her at 5 Watery Lane with the promise to return that afternoon, she felt as though a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Interacting with James was what she imagined being buried under a pile of sopping wet towels and then being made to stand up felt like a strong, persistent desire to give up, if only to escape one's misery. Inside the Shelby house, Polly greeted her with fresh bread and jam. Trixie made a beeline for the loaf, having been too unnerved by James's constant jabbering to sit down long enough to eat all morning. She took a seat beside Polly, who had the papers flipped open before her. They sat in comfortable silence, Trixie reading and Polly sipping tea, until Ada arrived downstairs with the groggy energy of a woman who had been fighting sleep and losing. Polly asked where she had been all day. Ada sawed at the bread with a knife and listed her morning's achievements: bed, inability to sleep, inability to wake, cold, a trip to the bathroom, and a dream about a bear on a boat. Trixie teased that the bear had been a relief. Ada shot her a look of mock surprise and confirmed that it absolutely had been. Then Ada turned her attention to the real matter at hand. She pulled her knees up to her chest and asked who the handsome man lurking outside had been. Trixie rolled her eyes and explained that he was her cop bodyguard. Ada teased that Tommy would get jealous, his fiancée spending time with another man. Trixie assured her that this particular cop was the one man who actually made Tommy's company seem pleasant. Handsome, sure, but there was nothing else going on behind it all except Daddy's money and an almost religious loyalty to the crown. Polly folded the newspaper and handed it to Trixie. They discussed the news: BSA on strike, miners on strike, IRA killing soldiers. Then Polly set the paper aside and said 2 words that changed the morning entirely: stand up. Ada asked why. Polly repeated the instruction. Ada sighed and stood, holding her hands out expectantly. Polly instructed her to turn sideways. Ada did. Trixie folded the newspaper shut, watching. Polly reached out and grabbed Ada's chest roughly. Ada leapt nearly a foot in the air, stumbling backwards. Polly warned her with a single word. Ada cast a nervous glance at Trixie, who shrugged. Polly asked how late Ada was. Ada's gaze dropped to the floor. She folded her arms across her chest self-consciously and admitted to 1 week, then corrected to 5. Then, huffing as though Polly had tortured the answer out of her, 7 if you counted weekends, Trixie exclaimed. Polly lowered herself into the chair slowly. Ada followed. The newspaper was pushed aside. Ada asked what she was supposed to do. Polly muttered that ideally she would have mentioned being late before it had been 7 weeks. Ada protested that she had thought it was a lack of iron. Her lip began to quiver, and she swiped at her eyes. God, she felt stupid. Polly reached across and took her hands. She was not stupid. She had done a stupid thing, but she was going to be all right. Trixie reached over and took Ada's other hand. No matter what, they would be there. Ada sniffled, her face hidden between her knees. What was she supposed to do now? Trixie knew the answer before Ada spoke it. The father was Freddie Thorne, the communist, the man Tommy despised. Ada loved him. Had loved him since before the war, when she'd had a schoolgirl crush, and he'd kissed her before shipping out to France. She'd written about it in her diary for a year. By the time he returned, she was no longer the lovesick kid sister. She was a force of nature. And now she was pregnant with his child, and he was missing, and the world was closing in. Polly said they would go to the clinic that evening, in disguise. Veils. Veils? Trixie would come for support. Ada nodded miserably. Polly said she would call the doctor. In the meantime, Trixie could make tea. Trixie stood and dug the kettle from the cabinet, casting a sideways look to ensure Polly was still upstairs. She grabbed Ada's hand and whispered that this was good news, yes? Ada smiled weakly and said she wanted it to be. Trixie asked where Freddie was. Ada shook her head vigorously. He was the only one. She loved him. Only him. And he loved her. He said so, but she did not know where he was. The raids. He had hidden her, and then left. She did not know when he was coming back, or if. Trixie pulled her chair closer. She told Ada to look at her. She guaranteed that nothing Ada was doing right now was anywhere near as bad as even the best things her brothers had done. They had Winston Churchill up their arses, and they were terrible personality-wise. Ada laughed through her tears. Trixie added that the hat did not suit Arthur at all. It was a dumb accessory for a big, scary gang. She took a deep breath. Even if everything went wrong, it would be nothing worse than a regular Tuesday with the Shelbys, and Ada would always have her. Ada sniffled and said, "All right." Then, after a moment of consideration, she asked if Trixie wanted children. If she got married for real, Trixie laughed and said she did not think she would be a very good mother. Ada protested. Trixie explained that she doubted she would fall in love again. Luca had been all she wanted. She did not know if anybody else could match up. Ada promised she would love again. Trixie disagreed. She just did not think she was meant for that type of thing anymore. Polly's heavy footsteps echoed down the staircase. Good news. The doctor would see Ada that evening at 5. They would go in disguise. Trixie would come along. Polly asked if Trixie could get her bodyguard to back down for the night. Trixie said she would manage it. Across town that evening, Trixie sat in a rickety wooden chair by Ada's side as a nurse performed the examination. Ada gripped Trixie's hand with such force it seemed she was already in the process of giving birth. The dark, candlelit room was frightening enough without the weight of everything at stake. Polly waited outside, where she could scope out passers-by. After a long moment of fidgeting, Ada looked up at the nurse and asked if she was pregnant or not. The nurse sighed. Trixie held her breath. Ada clutched her hand desperately. Then, a nod. Pregnant. Ada's hand fell slack. Trixie grabbed it before it dropped. The nurse said she would leave them to get dressed. Outside, after Polly had settled the bill with a well-practiced glare, Trixie pulled a cigarette from her purse. Ada said she needed one. Trixie handed it over wordlessly, pulled another for herself, and lit both. Polly scolded them to keep walking. If anyone saw them here, they would know. Ada announced that she was not getting rid of it. Trixie kept the surprise off her face. It was a bold choice, but not out of character. Polly, hand tight on Ada's arm, said they should get home and then talk. Ada skidded to a stop. She told Polly to get off her, or she would scream it. She swore. It was a hell of a bargaining chip. Trixie blew out a cloud of smoke, impressed. 2 men passed, eyeing Trixie and Ada. One elbowed the other and muttered something about one of them being a slag. Trixie turned and asked him to repeat himself. They exchanged a glance. The shorter one spat at her feet and called her a bitch. She called after them to keep walking. Cowards. When they had disappeared, she turned back to Polly and Ada, who were anchored in the middle of the street. Polly asked whose it was. Ada said nothing. Polly turned to Trixie, who said smoothly that she had not a clue. Polly called her a liar, but seemed mildly impressed. Ada interrupted. If she told them, they would tell the boys, and the boys would cut him to pieces. Polly said they would not if he married her. Ada folded her arms. Polly asked if he would marry her. Ada took a long drag from her cigarette. She did not know. She did not know where he was. Polly hissed and smacked her on the arm. Ada insisted he would come back. He had promised. He was a good man. Her voice had grown wobbly and breathy, straining with tears. Polly reached out to cradle her face, then deferred to Trixie for confirmation. Trixie chewed the inside of her cheek. She hated lying to Polly. But for Ada's sake, she said she did not think Freddie would lie. Polly sighed. Ada insisted he would come back. Gathering her into a hug, Polly pulled Ada close, offering her shoulder for the sobs. Over Ada's shoulder she met Trixie's eyes, dread sharp on Polly's face. She reached out for Trixie's hand behind Ada's back. It was clear enough to both of them that Ada had no intention of getting rid of it. What that meant, neither could say for certain. Peating, Paulers, and Wers and Consers, I Doctor, and Brown. The following week, the betting parlour was packed after Monaghan boys' win. Everyone wanted a piece of the magic horse before the afternoon race. Trixie's hours increased, and the notes kept piling. Finn skidded to a stop by her table with a top hat. She smiled at him and pushed the money in, pressing a few coins into his palm for food at the market. He beamed and disappeared into the crowd. Tommy appeared at the front door, his eyes locking onto her almost instantly. He pushed past the men and made a beeline in her direction. They needed to talk. She was working. He slung an arm around her back and guided her towards a corner. He told her she needed to point Campbell in the direction of the Lees. She asked who the Lees were. A Roma family. She raised an eyebrow. Were these the people he had started a war with? With a reluctant shrug, he admitted they were. He needed to send Campbell down the wrong track until he came up with a better plan. The admission of weakness struck an odd chord in her chest. When she envisioned the inside of Tommy's brain, it did not so much think as know. He never did anything without considering exactly what the consequences would be. The phrase, "until I come up with a better plan," was so human it nearly made her forget that she hated him. She agreed. She asked what evidence he wanted her to bring up. He told her to say they had a history of thievery, an alliance with the IRA. She asked if they actually did. He asked if it mattered. She supposed not. Then, as he turned away, gazing out at the chaos of the shop, he asked if she liked the races. She said she was ambivalent. He said he was wondering if she would like to accompany him to the tracks the following weekend. She glanced at him in disbelief. When she deduced he was not joking, she scoffed and said no. He clarified it was for business, not pleasure. He needed someone to help motivate Kimber into making a deal. She told him plainly that she was not a whore, not his sacrificial lamb. He insisted he needed her there as his accountant. She said she did not trust him. His smirk faltered the slightest bit. He changed the subject to her bodyguard. She explained that she had told James she needed to snoop, allegedly searching for another pressure point for the inspector. Also, he was fine, handsome and rich, but rather annoying. Tommy asked if he was handsome. Never thought of her as the type to fall for a copper. She retorted that she never thought of herself as the type to falsify an engagement to him either. And anyway, not that it was his business. She did not fancy him. He was poorly read and felt the need to share his opinions nonetheless. Tommy said it was not his business. She rolled her eyes and reminded him they were not actually engaged. He said he was aware. She told him to act like it. He sighed and said wives did not take lunch breaks with the rest of the staff. She opened her mouth, but no reply fell out, just a shortened sound of disbelief that snapped off as he turned and strode towards the office. Unbelievable. The nerve. Her late lunch came at 4 o'clock. Rather than the nearby cafe or the Garrison, she found herself heading to church, knowing James would not be far behind. She ducked into a confessional, and a moment later James settled on the other side of a screen. She told him, in a voice pitched an octave higher and pretending distress, that she might have something useful for the inspector. She had overheard conversations indicating the Lees were involved in a major robbery. They were Roma, mostly countryside-based, with some presence in town. They had an allegiance with the IRA, and the IRA were in line with the communists. James asked if she thought the IRA coordinated with a Roma clan to steal machine guns to aid communists. She squinted. Put like that, the case was rather flimsy, but it did not need to be foolproof, just enough for Campbell to go barking up the wrong tree. She added that the Lees had a history of thievery, that she had heard Thomas and his brothers discussing them. The IRA and communists were always looking for allies. Roma people had never been received well by the Crown. Would it not make sense for them to find friendship in each other? James suggested they leave the detective work to the inspector. She agreed, then added that she might be able to do more if James stayed at the apartment. He would notice a new face if he saw it enough times, a handsome one especially. James cleared his throat nervously. She told him business was improving. Tommy seemed happier, less angry. If he got worse, they could adjust. For now, it would compromise the investigation if he followed her everywhere. He agreed reluctantly. She told him she would be done working by 11. He said a woman like her had no business drinking with a woman like Polly. She resisted the urge to punch through the screen and attack him. She said it would be rather odd for her not to show up. He agreed that 11 worked, though his voice was strained. He called her Mrs. Shelby. She corrected him, Miss Price, but her words were lost in his clambering out of the confessional and the swing of the shutting door. The late night she had predicted arrived well past 10. All other occupants of the betting shop had retired, gone to the Garrison to celebrate, or been at the races to watch Monaghan Boy lose. The only people left were Tommy and Trixie. He seemed awfully glum for a man who could be rolling in cash. She called across the room, asking if something was wrong. He looked up, tossed a bundle of cash onto the table, and shot her an irritated glare. He assumed she knew about Ada. She taunted that babies were delights, and she was sure he was thrilled to be an uncle. He drawled, ecstatic. She said she could tell. He asked why she looked like she was about to light the winnings on fire. She pointed out he had made them rich, made himself richer. At that he looked up, but this time he was not angry or annoyed. He just looked exhausted, the purple rings under his eyes growing darker with the sky. Something in him was pleading for her to be gentle. It startled her. He said Freddie Thorne. Freddie fucking Thorne. She asked what was wrong with Mr. fucking Thorne. He was a fucking communist. She reminded him that Tommy was a fucking gangster. Let those in glass houses not cast stones. After a long quiet, he said Freddie had not married Ada. Trixie fell silent. "We?" she asked. What if he had? Tommy shrugged. Why bother asking? He had left town. Left her with the baby. She said she was sure if he put his mind to it, he could find Freddie. The Peaky Blinders could track down men hundreds of miles away who owed them debts. Surely Tommy Shelby could locate one communist, his childhood best mate, and return him to Birmingham for the sake of his younger sister. In lieu of an answer, Tommy stood and stalked to Arthur's office. For a moment she expected him to lock the door. Instead, he returned with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. This was an act of kindness, she realized, but she had no idea what to do with it. He poured whiskey into both glasses and gestured at one. She crossed the parlour and sat across from him. He told her to talk about the handsome copper. She listed, Cambridge-educated, military service, studied botany, thought The Scarlet Letter was the peak of modern literature, desperately egotistical. Not nearly as bad as the inspector, who had noted her down in his journal as a bit dumb. Tommy snorted and threw down a gulp of his drink. Bit dumb? She narrowed her eyes. The issue there better be with dumb, and not a bit. He set his glass down gently and said if she were dumb, she would not be working for him. She reminded him she did not work for him. She worked for Polly. He asked who she had made a deal with. She asked why he had picked this week to keep her out of work. He knew Monaghan Boy would lose. He knew they would be busy counting and recording. He said exactly. He had known they would be busy, and he could not have the Lees killing his accountant during the busiest week of the season. She eyed him critically. If he had actually wanted her protected, why not one of the Peaky Blinders?